if you're at a friend's house or a relative's house and they're using these cooking oils, you should really, for their benefit, just grab them and throw them in the garbage.
Without these seed oils, we would not have the burden of chronic disease that we do.
All right, let's answer the question. The best oils for weight loss are, Dr. Hyman?
Well, these two particularly are good oils. One is walnut oil, and the other is something you probably never heard of called black seed oil.
French fries is far worse than smoking, actually probably quite a lot of cigarettes. And the reason is, first of all, because of the fact that when we consume these oils,
that oil has been treated with Drano window washing acid, bleached and fried before it went in the bottle.
How is it that popular advice on cooking oil is not only different between different sources, but often completely contradictory?
A few weeks ago, I lost my mind and let people in the comments section talk me into wading into the edible oil controversy. I took the road less traveled to hear from scientists who spend their days actually doing science instead of the people who get the views by doing social media. I thought the scientists and I would get crushed on the socials after posting that episode for relying so heavily on human outcome data, but we didn't, and your comments were very inspiring, so thank you. But I did get legit pushback on a number of things, like why didn't I acknowledge that olive oil is a fruit oil? What about the omega-6 to 3 ratio? What about heating the oils and processing and bleaching? What about omega-3 supplements and personal things like how I looked as Mary Poppins and how I could never be seen by the world without my shirt on? So in this episode, I'll address as many questions from the comment section as I can. But for your sake, don't watch it all the way to the end. First question from Morphopolis. The fact that you don't know or pretend that you don't know that olive oil is not a seed oil but a fruit oil makes me believe this whole video is disingenuous. It's a good point, and I have to admit I threw up in my mouth a little bit every time I tried to choke out the term seed oil. I just think the term is so unclear, but I was trying to be respectful to the community who have concerns about oils because they feel very strongly about it.
Now, we call these cooking oils vegetable oils, okay? And that's a very euphemistic term because considering the fact that it's a lie.
You know, I always wonder about what PR room came up with the word vegetable oils. They're not made from vegetable oils, vegetables like broccoli or anything. They're made from seeds and beans. So there's actually should be called seed oils.
So they're not vegetable oils, they're seed oils.
I don't know what PR room came up with it either, but I thought it was pretty clear because we've been using it for so many centuries. For some reason, I have an unnatural interest in historical books about human health, and here's a fascinating one from 1655. Health's Improvement, or Rules Comprising and Discovering the Nature, Method, and Manner of Preparing All Sorts of Foods Used in This Nation, written by that ever-famous Thomas Moffat, doctor in physics. He noted that all our food consists of animal or vegetable substances, salt alone excepted. When I was a teen and we played the game 20 Questions, where you had to think of what someone was saying in 20 questions or less, my opening question was always, is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? And everyone understood. When the ever-famous Thomas Moffat used the term vegetable oil, it was in context like this. To this class also belong volatile alkaline salts united by repeat sublimations with an aromatic vegetable oil. Take the purest salt of hartshorn an ounce, chemical oil of lemons a dram, unite them by repeated sublimations in a tall glass vessel. It never occurred to me that the ever-famous Dr. Moffat was lying or had hired a PR firm to refer to lemon oil as a vegetable oil. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm nutcase enough to read health books from the 1600s, one reason is the modern interest people have in ancestral diets. A topic of the day when this was published was how the nutrition of tame animals compared to wild ones. And here's a partial list of the great variety they were eating. Compare that to our present monoculture of Frankenchicken. And it's the same story for the amazing variety of furry creatures they were eating compared to our modern, nearly monoculture beef diet. There's a great book called Burn by a paleoanthropologist who makes clear how dramatically different the modern diets that we call ancestral are from hunter-gatherer diets. He says the authors of our modern ancestral diets should definitely have consulted paleoanthropologists. Although, I guess lab-grown tiger steaks, lion burgers, and zebra sushi are coming to a market near you. Brace yourself for a whole new genre of diet books and shredded shirtless bodies to promote fake real tiger protein. Fake real? Back to the term seed oils. Ugh. From what I can tell, creating that term just injected more confusion into an already too large swamp of confusing terms. I tried to avoid that whole swamp in my last episode, but if we're going to talk about omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, I guess we better define our terms. The reason I think the term seed oils is so confusing to everyday consumers is consumers don't refer to nuts, legumes, and grains as seeds. They don't ask for seed and rice burritos or seed and seed burritos, and the headlines they see cast a wide net that seed oils are very bad. So an everyday consumer asks, is coconut a fruit, nut, or seed? And when they Google it, the answer they get is yes. And some people say that despite the headlines, not all seed oils are bad. You have to know which ones they're referring to. Kraft Zion said, only 3 minutes in and I see you're dancing around the oils in question, already headed down the misinformation pathway, talking about olive oil and sesame oil like anyone has objections to them. Let me spell it out: cottonseed oil, canola oil, corn oil, and vegetable oil. But I was seeing sesame oil on plenty of bad oil lists.
And I'm going to get right to the point today. Basically, stop eating these vegetable and seed oils, such as soybean and canola oil, corn oil, cottonseed, sunflower, peanut oil, sesame oil, and even rice bran oil.
And I saw a lot of concerns about olive oil too.
Olive oil is not all it's cracked up to be. See, olive oil has a little bit higher of an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, but it's also not as easily assimilated by the body. So when you're leaning towards a monounsaturated fat, try to go for something like the macadamia nut oil.
When I cook, I prefer cook with grapeseed oil than olive oil. If I need to make marinade or dressing, without hesitation, I will take olive oil. But to sear a steak or something like that really high, if I don't have a barbecue and I need a little bit oil, I will take the grapeseed oil.
You notice by the end of the last episode, I was referring to the oils as liquid oils, and I like that term for 3 reasons. 1, consumers can understand it. If it's liquid at room temperature, it's a liquid oil, as opposed to ones that are solid like lard, butter, coconut, and palm oils. 2, it includes some important oils like algal and fish oils. And 3, it speaks to saturation, which I think is the most important thing. Which brings up the question, what even is saturation in these oils? No worries, it's simple like H2O, so no need to glaze over when I show a simple diagram of a saturated fat molecule. It's a chain of carbon and hydrogen where each carbon atom is bonded once to its carbon neighbor. You know, like when you were line dancing and you grabbed the person's hand in front of you and the person's hand behind. And each carbon has 2 hydrogen, like when you had a child clinging to each leg when you were trying to line dance. That's the simple structure of coconut oil, completely saturated with hydrogen. You wouldn't think this would make much difference, but if 2 hydrogens go missing, then in the game of musical chairs molecules play, 2 carbons up their commitment to each other by bonding with 2 arms instead of 1. If that happens once in the chain, it's monounsaturated. Think olive oil. If it happens more than once, it's polyunsaturated. Think corn oil, or as some people say, a PUFA, short for polyunsaturated, but with added confusion. So olive oil would be a MUFA. Wondering Wanderer said this video didn't actually address the problems of seed oils. A better video would be to compare polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs, monosaturated fats, MUFAs, and saturated fats to health outcomes both acutely and long-term. Great suggestion. Walter Willett brings a ton of data to the table about this, partly because of his years at Harvard running huge studies.
Most of what we consume in the United States is unhealthy carbohydrates. That's the major part. That half our calories are from carbohydrates. Most of that is refined starch and sugar. So it's a very different question comparing saturated fat to those calories than, say, something specific like polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat. This is what we published a few years ago looking at type of fat in the diet in relationship with coronary heart disease, comparing each type of fat with the same number of calories from carbohydrate. And as you can see, trans fat was by far the worst. Saturated fat was very weakly related to risk of heart disease compared to the same number of calories from carbohydrate. But monounsaturated fat, and even more so polyunsaturated fat, were related to lower risk of coronary heart disease.
Here's another chart of Walter's.
Here we're looking at the ratio of polyunsaturated fat to saturated fat. And we've known for many decades, 50, 60 years, that higher intake of polyunsaturates reduce LDL, the bad cholesterol in our blood, and higher intake of saturated fats increase the levels of LDL in our blood. So that ratio of polyunsaturated to saturated fat is a very long-standing way to evaluate the quality of fats in foods or overall diets. And beef has very little polyunsaturated fat in it and quite a bit of saturated fat. And so that ratio is really extremely low for beef. Chicken has a lot more polyunsaturates. That looks a lot better than compared to beef, but salmon's even better. And there's a huge difference with these plant-based sources of protein.
In terms of long-term health, the shortest life expectancies are associated with the left side of that chart and the longest to the right. So do these guys remind anybody of Twitter trolls arguing about seed oils? Kent Purdy said, the biggest surprise of this take is the lack of difference in health between omega-3 and 6 oils. This is different than what I've been reading for decades. Yeah, I still remember a talk Michael Greger gave about that 20 years ago when he had more hair that has since gone viral on the internet.
Up until 100 years ago, we've been eating about roughly equal amounts of omega-3s and omega-6s. So we've had an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 1:1 or 1.
That talk got me wondering what omega-3, 6, and 9 really mean, and why are the ratios so magical? Bill Harris is very respected by scientists for his 40 years of doing science on omega-3s. Here's how he thinks about the ratio.
Now, this whole thought that the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is so important, everyone's so concerned about eating too much omega-6, which, the dietary sources, major dietary sources these days are vegetable oils, refined oils, but, getting them through. And then people have become scared about getting them through whole foods, like eating nuts and flaxseed and healthy food. Yeah. So what do you think? What are your thoughts on this index?
Well, I agree. I mean, the ratio, the concept makes some sense. It's very imprecise. Because when you say omega-3, you don't know what you're talking about, ALA, EPA, or DHA. It could be any of them. And when you say omega-6, you don't really know. There's 7 omega-6 fatty acids in the blood. Which ones are you talking about? And so you don't know what this ratio, you can't act upon it because you don't know what you're acting upon. The other problem is you can have a high omega-3 intake and a high omega-6 intake, or low omega-6 and a low omega-3 and have the same ratio. So that doesn't help because the problem is that you can fix a bad ratio by taking more omega-3, and that's the right way to do it. But you cannot fix it and improve your health by leaving your omega-3 intake alone and just lowering your omega-6, which that ratio people tend to do that. They think, well, I got to fix it. Well, the way to fix it, there's only one way to fix it. It's a good way to fix it. It's to eat more EPA, DHA. That's fine. If you want to play that ratio game and fix it that way, okay. But don't take it any further than that.
100% agree with you. That's my thoughts. Is that really it's the low omega-3 intake that's the problem, and that you need to increase that omega-3 intake.
I mean, we published 2 papers with this consortium of the 17 or 20 cohorts. We've had several other papers, all looking at fatty acids and some outcome. And one of them looked at linoleic acid levels in the blood and cardiovascular outcomes, and found that the higher the linoleic acid, the lower the risk for cardiovascular disease. And another paper looked at linoleic acid levels and risk for developing diabetes. Higher omega-6, linoleic, lower risk for developing diabetes. So when you look at that kind of data, when you're talking about a biomarker, it's not a dietary intake questionnaire thing that everybody questions. You're looking at a biomarker of omega-6 intake, linoleic acid. You can't make it. And higher levels are associated with lower cardiovascular and diabetic risk. It's hard to say they're bad.
Right.
I mean, you could turn that around and say lowering your levels of linoleic is going to increase your risk for atherosclerosis.
So there's several omega-3s, and he only mentioned supplementing with 2 of them, and there's 7 omega-6s. And what are the differences between omega-3s and omega-6s? Well, alpha means beginning and omega means end, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Fats are long chains with a beginning and an end. So if the first carbon double bond is 3 carbons from the end, that's an omega-3. If 6 from the end, that's an omega-6. Good to know. You wouldn't think that would make such a big difference, but it does. They're both polyunsaturated fats, and that's why I was careful to enunciate the first carbon bond. I get the feeling that in the language of the internet, many people are referring to omega-6s when they say PUFAs. But to scientists, they're all PUFAs. Scientists aren't too good at naming things, so they decided naming them after the Greek alphabet wasn't obscure enough. So some scientists decided to call them N-3 or N-6 fats. Same thing, but with added confusion. So why do scientists refer to them as fatty acids when talking to consumers instead of just fats? I think it's because they haven't read the book Insanely Simple, a truly great book. I lived this book because I worked for Steve Jobs and I knew these authors. I told a story about one of my adventures with Steve in a TEDx talk. So why did Bill only talk about supplementing with DHA and EPA even though he mentioned ALA?
Omega-3 fatty acids, there's 3 of them. Most of the time I'm focused, when I think about my enthusiasm for omega-3, I think about the marine sources
Yes.
of EPA and DHA, but there's another source, ALA.
So we generally put them in 2 camps. There's the plant-based omega-3s, alpha-linolenic acid, ALA, is the 18-carbon omega-3, compared to the 20 or 22-carbon long marine omega-3s, EPA and DHA. And they are all in the same chemical family, but they are not, it's like, third and fourth cousins. And ALA has not got the cardioprotective benefits of EPA and DHA.
What do you think the best source of the omega-3s would be for someone who is a vegetarian or a vegan?
Vegetarian or vegan would be an algal oil. The original source of EPA and DHA in a fish is not that they make omega-3. They don't really make omega-3 any better than we do, or make EPA and DHA. They eat preformed EPA and DHA when it comes from their food sources, which at the bottom of the food chain is these single-celled microalgae. And I'm not talking about seaweed, but these little organisms that convert sunlight into fatty acids, some of which are omega-3. And so different companies have identified which specific strains of algae, microalgae, will make DHA or EPA or both. And they've commercialized or they industrialized it and they harvest the oil. It's an expensive process at this point.
So the vegan argument is the body can convert ALA, which comes from land plants like flax seeds, to EPA and DHA, which comes from algae. The concern is, does your body convert enough to get optimal levels, and does the conversion depend on your heredity, state of health, and, for example, how much omega-6 fats you eat? And how would you know?
People very often confuse those 2 sources. They think they'll list good sources of omega-3. They'll say salmon and sardines, then they'll say chia seeds and black walnuts, and just throw it all in together, and it's very misleading because the plant-based omega-3s are not nearly as potent.
ALA gets converted into EPA in the body, correct?
And can be, yes.
It can be. The conversion of ALA into EPA and DHA there's huge inter-individual variation.
The thing about Bill is, in addition to being a professor doing A-level research, he and his PhD daughter Christina started an important company called Omega Quant. You go online, order a test kit like I did, put a drop of blood in the kit, and get a report of omega-3s in your blood. They assign a number to it and call it your omega-3 index.
So you very recently published a study that correlated the omega-3 index to all-cause mortality.
Right.
It was able to even predict mortality.
Right. It's going to be probably one of my capstone studies, I think, in hindsight. It was a collaboration among 17 different cohorts, like the Framingham study's a cohort, Women's Health Initiative's a cohort, MESA, EPIC. These are all, and from all around the world. These are groups that have been recruited at one point in time, blood samples taken, fatty acid levels measured in that blood, and then the investigators just follow this group of people over time to see what happens, what kind of diseases they get, who dies, who doesn't. So we looked basically between age 65 and 75, who died in that window of time. And we found that the people that had the highest omega-3 levels compared to the lowest were 15% or so less likely to die over that time. And it was when you look at quintiles of omega-3, it was very dose dependent. The higher the omega-3, the lower the risk.
Bill Harris often warns that vegans average an omega-3 index of 3.5, and the optimal level for longevity is 8 or above. A lot of people swimming out in that cold ocean water. Who's an idiot enough to do that? I did the Escape from Alcatraz triathlon a few times, and as we were getting set to plunge in the water, the race organizers would joke, many are cold, but few are frozen. Remember in the last episode how we saw that the 9,000 vegans were not like the other vegetarians and the pescatarians? They ate a lot more fruits and vegetables for one thing, and so their outcomes were much better in these metrics.
This is all data from Adventist Health Study 2. And you can see on the left, for average height females, it's kind of like a step ladder. And the vegans are certainly much lighter than others for the same height. When it comes to hypertension, and again, you can see that same progression from vegans up through non-vegetarians. If we turn now to diabetes, another common risk factor for cardiovascular disease and a number of other diseases, you can see again there's a threefold at least difference in risk.
So of course you would expect them to outlive the others, right? Right?
Do vegans do better than other vegetarians? I hesitate to go here, but let's try. Overall, from our data, the answer is no, if you're willing to look at total mortality, which some will say is only part of the picture, and it probably is. Morbidity is important. Vegans do have less cardiovascular disease, less cancer of the breast and prostate. Of the various vegetarian patterns, interestingly, it's the pesco vegetarians that actually have the lowest mortality, although it's unclear yet whether this is due to the fish.
I don't understand why, if they're dying at lower rates of cancer and heart disease, they don't live longer, but I hope to interview Dr. Fraser and find out. That's a pretty cool wheel, huh? The usual two suspects are vegans are not always diligent about supplementing with B12, and maybe they're missing out on the marine sources of omega-3s because they don't eat fish.
Because fish is disgusting. How bored are you with eating if you're ordering the fish? You know, just bring me something gross. I like to waste money.
Robbie Barbero is a very disciplined vegan who eats a lot of fruit and no oils. So let's see what his Omega Quant results were.
So there's a lot to look at here, but we're just going to do really quickly. So here's this stuff called ALA, the omega-3 essential fat. Our body cannot make it. We absolutely need it. It's absolutely essential. Well, he's getting some of that from his greens and from his fruit and maybe a few chia seeds here and there. He's in good shape. So then the big question is, can the body make this stuff EPA and this stuff DHA out of this stuff ALA?
So young and healthy Robbie is above 8, but what about the rest of us who don't eat fish? It's hard to know without having test results, so we're seeing a lot of recommendations to supplement with marine sources of omega-3 for insurance.
The problem is that people who don't eat fish may be under 4.4. Nearly 2/3 of vegans may fall below 4, suggesting a substantial number of vegans have an omega-3 status associated with accelerated brain aging. The average American just exceeds the threshold at about 4.5, though if you age and gender match for the vegans, ironically, the omnivores did just as bad. There's not a lot of long chains and Big Macs either. But having a nutrient status no worse than those eating a standard American diet is not saying much. And so that's why I recommend everyone eat a plant-based diet along with contaminant-free EPA and DHA to get the best of both worlds, omega-3 levels associated with brain preservation while minimizing exposure to toxic pollutants.
There have been a lot of omega-3 supplementation studies that have produced mixed results. And the question became, what if the dose wasn't big enough? After all, the dose you get in a supplement is usually much less than a single gram.
That's what's predominantly been studied, low doses of mixtures of EPA or DHA.
My mother and grandmother, both organic chemists, made sure I had a teaspoon of cod liver oil every day growing up, which is almost 5 grams. Yuck.
Maybe part of the reason prior trials of omega-3 fatty acids were negative was in part they used lower doses.
And that led to 2 absolutely fascinating studies of omega-3 supplementation.
So what I'm going to speak about today is the Reduce It trial. So the overall design is shown here. Patients about 8,000 plus with established cardiovascular disease in 70% of the population. Patients were followed for several years, up to 6.2 years. The randomization was 4 grams a day of icosapent-ethyl.
Icosapent-ethyl is a prescription drug where they've stripped out every component of fish oil but EPA. Why just EPA? Because EPA is thought to be the omega-3 for the heart. DHA is for the brain. This was a heart study. Here's why he didn't use an over-the-counter supplement.
This is work from Preston Mason, a colleague of mine from Harvard Medical School. He's a basic researcher. But this was an interesting analysis he did looking at the fatty acid content of the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. And you've got to take my word that it's the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. I know what it is, but he won't let us say what it is because he's afraid he might get sued by that company. So it's the leading U.S. fish oil supplement. He took a look at what's actually in there. And there is some EPA in there in red and DHA in purple. So, that's presumably why people are buying it, because they're thinking they're getting omega-3 fatty acids. But there's a bunch of saturated fat there and a bunch of other fats in there too. So that's the problem.
The control group got a placebo of mineral oil because it was considered inert. I thought you couldn't find a better designed study with a more talented team. The scientist and cardiologist in the clips you just heard is Deepak Bhatt, a professor at Harvard who's deeply respected by other scientists. And the results were spectacular.
Events reduced by icosapent ethyl versus placebo from 28% to 23%. It's a hazard ratio of 0.75, a relative risk reduction of 25% or so. And death from cardiovascular causes significantly reduced by 20%.
You almost never see a trial that is considered medical practice changing like this one. Absolute home run, right? The great thing about science is you trust in God but tie your horse.
In parallel, we did a 13,000 patient trial called STRENGTH.
The STRENGTH study gave the same 4-gram dose of purified omega-3s, but this time it was a mixture of EPA and DHA. And instead of a mineral oil, they used corn oil as the placebo. So if you're concerned about seed oil toxicity, this trial would be very important, because giving the control group 4 grams of corn oil per day over years in a trial involving 13,000 people should suss out how toxic it is, right? And to many people's shock, the trial was stopped early because essentially the corn oil outperformed the omega-3s. Wait, what? There was no difference between omega-3s and corn oil in coronary events, but the omega-3s had some undesirable side effects like longer bleed times, gastrointestinal distress, and some AFib. The corn oil didn't. So what is the explanation? Here's what Dr. Neeson said, who's at the Cleveland Clinic and was in charge of the trial.
When we were designing STRENGTH, we knew that we needed to have a placebo that would appear identical, but that would have no effects. And after much discussion, we used corn oil. And what you'll see is that the corn oil group, there was no effect on any of the lipid or inflammatory biomarkers. If you then compare STRENGTH and reduce it, you see an absolutely stunning finding. In reduce it, C-reactive protein in the control group, which used mineral oil, C-reactive protein went up over 30%. LDL went up. ApoB went up. And so we think that STRENGTH demonstrates fairly clearly that reduce it is a false positive study. That what you really are seeing is the adverse effects of mineral oil and not the favorable effects of purified EPA.
If you distrust science, you can look at the Reduce It trial and say, see, science is often wrong. If you're like me and you think science is the best way of knowing in the long term, you can say, see, science is self-correcting. Here's what a science YouTuber I greatly admire says.
As flawed as our science may be, it is far and away more reliable than any other way of knowing that we have.
Dr. Christina Jacksonville's daughter says maybe this is telling us that omega-3s are best used as supplements in modest doses, not as pharmaceuticals in high doses.
Omega-3s are blessed and cursed because they are seen as both a drug and a nutrient because of the pretty powerful nutritional studies. We kept pushing them more into the drug realm. Omega-3s might not be good drugs, but does that mean that omega-3s are not an important nutrient? I don't think so.
So what do I take away from all this? Well, I haven't spent my life studying omega-3s like Bill and Christina have, so I'm taking their advice to get my levels checked. I've also taken Dr. Greger's advice to take 250 milligrams of a combination of DHA and EPA in algal form. Hopefully I'll get my OmegaQuant results in a couple of days and can include them in this episode. By the way, as I was listening to leading cardiologists debating these studies, I wondered what they thought of edible fats. Here's Dr. Neil Stone, who has a very high profile as a lipid expert.
I saw a lady in the office, though, the other day. It was 2 years ago. Her LDL was 230, and on repeat it was 220. And I asked my fellow, what would you like to give her? He said, 80 of atorvastatin, Dr. Stone. I said, let's take a nutritional history. She was on this crazy diet, coconut oil, hardly any carbohydrates, just lots of fat, high-fat dairy, fatty cuts of red meat. I said, why don't we just see for 3 months, since there's no family history of high cholesterol, no family history of premature heart disease. Let's see what happens when we put you on a Mediterranean-style diet, where we talk about good fats like extra virgin olive oil, canola oil. Try to avoid the bad fats and try to avoid the bad carbs like sugar, but have plenty of fruits and vegetables and whole grains. Her LDL fell to 140, but I said, why don't we come back in 6 months? It fell to 130. Why don't you come back in a year? It fell to 120. And I turned to the fellow and I said, how much atorvastatin do you want to give her? He said, I think we'll pass on this one, Dr. Stone. I said, good call.
Fly Spleen said, one question, has processing of seed oils always been so extreme? What shocked me in What I've Learned's video is the ultra-processing. We know ultra-processing results in food that seems to be harmful. So basically, I'm wondering if seed oils are bad nowadays because of the processing. Thanks. Great question. Stefan Goyenet, a scientist I admire, wrote, one of the most valuable heuristics in nutrition is also one of the simplest. Eat minimally refined foods. I have long been suspicious of oils for this very reason because they seem very refined. But even I, the guy who is so down on processed foods, has to admit that the human outcome studies don't back up what seems so intuitively obvious and scary to most of us, that these are really refined foods. As we saw from the strength trial, a daily dose of 4 grams of corn oil had no detectable negative effects, at least over the course of a few years. In the large and very long-term Harvard studies, the liquid oils looked very good when they replaced saturated fat or they replaced white flour and sugar. But of course not when they're combined with white flour and sugar to make donuts. The one proviso is there are very respected doctors who care for the acutely ill in heart disease, diabetes, dementia, and they don't like their acutely ill patients eating oils, and I have to respect that. Kirkir wrote a related question. For me, any oil that uses hexane or other chemicals during processing isn't something I want in my body. I agree with you, and with hexane being so common in cleaning fluids, gasoline, glues, inks, etc., we should all use a lot of caution. But it's a highly volatile liquid, and that's why we breathe so much of it when we fill our cars with gas, and that's why there's so little of it left in edible oils after the refining process. Dr. Crosby tackled this question on Harvard's site. It has been estimated that refined vegetable oils extracted with hexane contain approximately 0.8 milligrams of residual hexane per kilogram. That's less than 1 part per million. It's also estimated that the level of ingestion of hexane from all food sources is less than 2% of the daily intake from all other sources, primarily gasoline fumes. So there appears to be very little reason for concern about the trace levels of hexane in canola oil, for example. Hexane is on the red list, and the EU has very strict limits of less than 1 part per million in edible oil. In Iran, scientists bought 23 different oils in the store and didn't find any that exceeded that standard. By contrast, OSHA allows up to 500 parts per million of hexane in the air at your workplace, and you breathe that all day long. Sheesh, it sounds like I'm defending oils when I've been suspicious of them for so long and I consume so little of them. But we have to be honest about the data we're seeing. And that brings me to comments like Stefan Finn's. I hoped you would bring up more points made by the gentleman at the beginning of the video, Chris Kenobi. I watched the lecture and found it to be somewhat convincing of the fact that seed oils play a huge part in our modern problems, especially with his points about no or near zero registered cases of heart disease before we got flooded with processed foods and oils. I watched that lecture too and read one of his books, The Omega-6 Apocalypse, and he does speak with great conviction. The University of Minnesota has a wonderful essay about the history of heart attacks in previous centuries. The bottom line is the symptoms were common, but they didn't know what it was until the 1920s. And extensive MRI scans of mummies from around the world have shown heart disease was always common in around 30% of every population tested. The most relevant thing, though, is now that we've collected such vast amounts of data over the last 70 years when the oils have been around, is do they cause or prevent such things as heart attacks? And the studies are as clear as they can be. The liquid oils, all of them, reduce heart attacks when they replace saturated fats or when they replace white flour and refined sugar. Chris Kenobi is joined by at least a dozen like-minded doctors, and every time I listen to them, I hear these astounding claims, like Chris Kenobi's claim that French fries are worse than smoking.
But he wrote a great book. I think you'd totally geek out with him. It's called The PEO Solution. And I said, Professor Peskin, what's worse, smoking cigarettes or these vegetable oils? And I know you've had this conversation before with Dave Asprey and others. He said if somebody smoked 2 packs of cigarettes every single day for about 28 years, their chances of developing lung cancer is about 16%, according to his research. And then he said if somebody ate these cooked vegetable oils, these toxic 8, hateful 8, for every single day for up to 28 years, their chances of developing a cancer and or heart disease was about 86%. So how does that line up with your research?
Yeah, I would say it's probably close. If you include other diseases that you don't want, like Alzheimer's and autoimmune diseases, we're approaching 100.
But the omega-3s increase your metabolic rate, increase your oxygen metabolism. They give, when you take the right kind and the right amount, they will give you 40 to 60% increase in stamina in whatever is your sport of preference.
When I hear astonishing claims like those, I always want to see the data, but I've never been able to track down the data that backs up those claims. They often put up a chart showing the trend in obesity, saying seed oils did this to us. But other people blame the obesity crisis on sugar or activity level. Stefan Goyenet even produced this chart as a joke, saying you could even blame the obesity crisis on low-carb diet books. The only one who has done A-level science about food and weight gain and has convincing data that I know of is Kevin Hall from the National Institutes of Health.
There had never been a randomized controlled trial to investigate any aspect of ultra-processed foods. What we were focused on, because my lab is primarily interested in obesity, is to ask the question of if you were to provide people with exposure to these foods in a controlled setting. We had these people come in and stay with us for 28 days continuously, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, and exposed them to all of their food and measured every morsel of food that they ate over the entire 28-day period. And in random order, we assigned them to 2 weeks of the ultra-processed diet, followed immediately by 2 weeks of the unprocessed diet, or vice versa. And the question that we were interested in was, did these folks, when they were given very simple instructions, just eat as much or as little as they want, did they have any difference in calorie intake? Here's the day-to-day energy intake, average energy intake of the folks, these same folks, again in random order, exposed to the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. There was about an average of 508 calories a day different between these two diets.
In that context, I really understand the concern about seed oils. We've known for a very long time that combining sugar, salt, and fat to make processed food is a toxic cocktail. But not using moderate amounts of oil in an otherwise healthy diet, like using them for salad dressing. In the last episode, I quoted Stefan Goyenet as saying the case against seed oils has largely collapsed. And someone pointed out that he was talking about obesity, not toxicity, and that Udo explains toxicity well. It's also known that fats get severely modified when heated, etc., and refining them heats them up many times. And Udo also explains how bleaching, etc., modifies them even further.
And that oil has been treated with Drano window washing acid, bleached and fried before it went in the bottle.
Ugh, it hurts my soul to think how many views talks like that get. Drano has lye, L-Y-E, and windshield washing fluid has methanol, a poisonous alcohol. Neither are used in processing edible oils. The bleaching of oils refers to removing color through filtration, not by using the chemical bleach that Drano has in it. Yes, you can oxidize some oils by heating them too high and watch them turn brown, kind of like this apple is oxidizing and going brown that I'm eating. But it's nothing like the oxidation that comes from grilling a steak or chicken. But if you're worried about it, you can cook with an oil like avocado or canola with high smoke points. Just be aware the food you're cooking inside the oil will probably oxidize at a much lower temperature than the oil will. I've seen a dozen videos saying coconut oil has a high smoke point because it's saturated. But my understanding is virgin unrefined coconut oil has a 350-degree smoke point, and the refined version goes up to 450. Generally, the more refining, the higher the smoke point, because refining removes things that oxidize, which are often beneficial nutrients. Yes, repeatedly heating oil to high temperatures in commercial fryers, where the oil takes on oxidized food of various kinds, does gradually alter the oil. But that's easy to study, and the effects haven't been dramatic. Not even in the same universe as flame broiling beef or grilling chicken. I'll provide some links in the description. I sometimes get asked why I haven't debated people in the anti-seed oil camp. I view my role as not to pretend that I'm in the same pay grade as doctors and scientists who devoted their lives to this. My mission is to uncover what the best scientists have discovered and present it in a way that hopefully consumers can understand. But like you, I'm very interested in what a debate like that would look like, and it's our lucky day, because I noticed that Matthew Nagra, who's above my pay grade, did a 4-hour debate with Tucker Goodrich, moderated by Simon Hill.
A 35% reduction in risk of all-cause mortality and a 33% reduction in risk of fatal atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease is a small benefit.
Well, it also showed a large increase in cancer in the intervention group towards the end of it, right?
So that's I mean, that
you don't get to just ignore that.
Why did you do it?
It's something that I think needs to be addressed, and what better way to address it than by actually challenging the views of one of the more prominent people in that space.
What did you learn from the 4 hours?
As far as content, it was 100% during preparation where I really learned about the specifics, like how good the data is for vegetable oil consumption, especially when compared to the saturated fats, because it is very strong data.
So Chris, you ask, why are some doctors on social media so convinced oils are toxic and the experts in the field pay no attention to them?
I don't know that anyone's arguing over like olive oil versus canola oil. Like there's a canola oil. Like,
they are.
Well, no, what
They definitely are.
What I'm getting at is that I don't know that like people in academia are arguing about this.
Right.
I think people who are like big seed oil, like,
conspiracy theorists.
100%. Those are the people who are irrelevant because they make up, very small proportion, but very vocal, mind you. So from a social learning perspective. So what I'm getting at is like actual professionals and experts in the field are not arguing about this.
Gil Carvalho gave a masterclass in one of his YouTube videos about logical leaps in science, where you make observations like oils get exposed to hexane, they change composition if you heat them too much, we're eating a lot more of them than we used to, and you make the logical leap that they harm human health. It's very intuitive, but this is why real scientists do real experiments. If I hadn't seen the results of some of these big, well-run studies, I never would have believed that oil could be healthy in some contexts. Don't Pass Silver said, it would be interesting to see if a diet which contains some oils is superior or not to a diet which avoids all oils. It sure would. I'm not aware of a study like that, but if someone knows of one, I'd be fascinated. But I'm willing to bet it depends on what the oil is compared to. If compared to nuts and legumes and veggies and fruits and whole grains, my bet is oils would lose. But we do have very solid data to compare liquid oils to butter and lard and coconut and palm oils, and oils crush them. Grimy Honky Racing said, and you look pretty good in lipstick. Why, thank you. Nancy Stueve said, the most shocking takeaway from this video is how attractive Chris McCaskill is dressed as Mary Poppins. I have to call out gross misinformation when I see it, and I think I know what Dr. Ken Berry would say about that comment.
It's a lie.
Why are you still here? Go watch some nutrition videos on Gil Carvalho's channel. He's great. You don't want to see this next bit. One commenter said, congratulations, you made the malnourished 8 list. That sounds like a great accomplishment for a guy whose BMI is 23, has podiumed in many Ironman competitions, has never shown a nutrient deficiency in a blood test, and is on no medications, right? I like endurance sports, and you can't be fast if you're carrying bulk, and the coaches are always pestering you to get lighter. We endurance athletes are used to weightlifters saying we don't look man enough, am I right? But hey, if you want to see muscular vegans, you can check out Simon Hill, Nimai Delgado, and dozens of others. Another guy said, you could never take your shirt off, and I'm only willing to take nutritional advice from people who are willing to show what they got. But you're right, I couldn't strut my stuff on the socials right now because I got 4 grandkids in high school, and can you imagine their friends coming up to them and saying, ooh, you got a grandpa who's off doing that on YouTube? The young grandkids did like the Tooth Fairy gig though, but I can tell a story about the one that got away. I have a friend who's motorcycling through Africa, and he bought me this. Very nice gift. I wasn't sure how you attach that, but obviously a loincloth, right? And I thought, well, to thank him, I'll just sneak out on my wife's scooter, sit there for just enough time to take a photo and send it to him privately. When my wife saw me do that in front of the house on her scooter, even briefly, she said, Chris, you get back in here right now. Yeah, well, that's not how they wear those in Africa. And so he printed an 8x10 and took it to every African village, to the hilarity of the villagers. But of course, my friend made sure it went public and humiliated everyone. My 3 sons even hacked my wife's phone so she can't forget it. Ironically, when I was answering the malnourishment question, this photo of Lester Wright popped up in my feed, and I thought, uh-oh, he's so trim, some people are going to get the impression he's malnourished.
Right here from the Shore Athletic Club, our boy, Lester Wright, who is 100 years old.
But when he brought the whole stadium to their feet by breaking the world record in the 100-meter dash for men over 100 years old, he looked well enough nourished to my eyes. He credited his strictly regimented diet, like alternating cream of wheat and oatmeal each day. Looks like in his case, grains didn't turn out to be the poison the internet thinks they are.
Grandpa, you said you never tested low on nutrient, and you just did.
You're malnourished, Grandpa. You're gonna need a bigger dose, Grandpa.
It's true, I'm a 6, and if you think the omega index is legit, that means I just got a D. That despite supplementing at Dr. Greger's recommended rate and eating a tablespoon of ground flax, chia, or hemp seeds every day and eating all the other omega-3 rich foods aside from fish. As a former earth scientist, I can't bring myself to eat fish. Few of us can because we know what we're doing to the oceans. How could I ace DHA but EPA was a fail? What's wrong with my body that can't even absorb EPA from supplements? Is Dr. Greger's recommended dose too lame for me? After all, just a 3-ounce portion of farm salmon supposedly gives you 1,240 milligrams of DHA and 590 of EPA. So I went and grabbed a bottle of my supplements and found out I got faked out by the label. I read it too quickly as DHA and EPA, but in fact it's DHA and DPA, an omega-3 that we didn't talk about in this episode. There is no EPA in this bottle. So I went looking for an algal source that had significant EPA and couldn't believe all the DHA-only versions out there. Are there some economies of producing algal-based omegas I wasn't aware of that makes DHA only cheaper to produce? And as I investigated, I discovered that producing this stuff is complicated enough to blow your mind. Interestingly, Omega Quant chose a specific omega-6 and omega-3 to calculate a ratio. Arachidonic acid as the omega-6 and EPA as the omega-3. The concern in some circles is arachidonic acid in excess can be no bueno. But despite my lame EPA levels, I aced this one because the main sources of arachidonic acid are chicken, eggs, and beef, which I don't eat. Arachidonic acid is a long story, and this episode is already insanely long, and I've only gotten to half your questions, so...
So you've been a sea captain for how long?
I was first a captain at 19 years old on San Francisco Bay.
And now you're trying to get your adorable grandson hooked on it.
I am working very hard to get my grandson addicted to sailing. Hey, Ollie, do you like ships?
Yeah?
Oh, yeah.
Ollie's adorable.
Oh, thank you.